So when we decided that we were going to do a book based on the 8 different species of bears, this was one that I was really interested in moderating the discussion of and reading more about. I'd like to introduce our guest expert today, Dr. Aaron Gurecki. And Aaron actually used to work together at IU School of Medicine, both studying malaria. And Aaron now works at the zoo. So would you like to tell us a little bit more about yourself, what you do at the zoo?
Absolutely. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. I can put my to be louder. Excellent. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Aaron Gurecki. I do work at the Indianapolis Zoo. I am in the education department, and I am the science writer in the education department. So I am a full-time science communicator now. I have had a number of different jobs over my career. As Elizabeth mentioned, I worked over at the IU School of Medicine. I taught biology for many years at Butler University, and I have other backgrounds in scientific editing, informal science education, and public science outreach. So we were discussing before this event began, I have a liberal arts background. I just like lots of things, and I do enjoy books. So I was glad to be asked. I am not a bear expert, we'll just say that. But I work with people who are bear experts, and I'm happy to weigh in on some of what I've learned from them and how what they're learning about wildlife can help us make informed decisions in our own lives.
Thank you. That kind of leads into one of the first questions that I had for you, which was, in the book, Gloria kind of describes a lot of the different bear scientists that she worked with as she was traveling around the world, and like talked about kind of the eccentricities of some of those scientists. Can you tell us more about the bear scientists that you work with and what they're like and what their day-to-day lives look like?
Sure. So I think one thing I found interesting about the book was that this was a journalist who was making a good effort to go interview people with interesting stories. And I think storytelling in science is super important. It's a great way to engage with the topic. And so by finding these interesting individuals and telling us their stories, we got a little glimpse into some of the challenges of studying wildlife. At the zoo, we have, of course, some really dedicated folks who help take care of animals at the zoo. We have 2 brown bears at the zoo. They are Miak and, no, Mikal and Kiak. And the folks that take care of animals there are hugely dedicated to animal well-being and to help us care for animals that would not have been able to be in the wild and serve as ambassadors for their wild counterparts. They're super enthusiastic about animals. That's a key part of their job. And I think you saw that enthusiasm and compassion in the stories of the people in the book. I also work with people who are in the conservation world that are studying how to help a lot of different species around the world, animals, fungi, and plants. And it's a collaborative effort. There's no one person doing this work. And I think that was another key point in the book, is that while she may have been interviewing a few individuals, it's definitely not an individual effort. It takes huge numbers of people working together to make a difference for wildlife. So I think some of the things that the people I know have in common is just their passion, their commitment. They are tireless, and everybody's just really committed to doing what's best for a wide range of species.
Would you mind telling us a little bit more about the bears at the zoo? Can you say their names again?
Yes. Well, no, I didn't do it right the first time, but I'll try again. Mikal and Kiak. There we go. They are a male and female brown bear. So there's 2 of them. They both came to the zoo about a little more than 10 years ago as cubs. They were each found orphaned in the wild and would not have been able to survive. And so they came to live in human care, and they've been with us ever since. They display a wide range of bear-like behaviors, and I'm sure today they were appreciating their water feature. We got some great pictures of them, all cool and wet. So, but yeah, they've grown up together.
Something that I think is really cool, like when you go see bears at the zoo, or if you've ever been lucky enough to encounter them in the wild, is sometimes they have like such human-like traits. The last time that I went to the zoo, we were watching the bears. One of them just like sauntered into their pond and then just sat there like this, like they were in a bathtub. And I was like, oh, they're just like us.
Yeah, I was walking through that area yesterday, and I noticed one of them. I don't know which one because their back was to me, but they had an itch, and they were rubbing their hip against one of the rock walls to get that itch out. And then that probably wasn't good enough, so the bear stood up on its hind legs, something that she talked a little bit about in the book, how tall a bear is when they're standing up. It is quite impressive, and then a little back scratch on the wall. So I think that idea of bears, especially when they're on 2 feet, feeling we can connect with that because we also stand on 2 feet. And I think that's an important part of both the bear conservation story and the challenges of bears in the wild.
I think that's also one of the scenes in the Jungle Book is Baloo gets up on his back and like scratches up against the rocks. Something that the author mentioned in the book is that it seems like there's almost more of like a difference in reverence between northern cultures and southern cultures when it comes to bears. Would you be able to touch upon that more? Like, why do you think that might be?
Yeah, I did a little reading beyond the paragraph or so where she touched on that. I thought that was an interesting point as well. I hadn't put a lot of thought into it, but I think this idea that they do stand up on 2 feet, and in many cultures they're considered close kin, that there's a kinship relationship that many cultures have ascribed to bears, and especially in the northern hemisphere. I was reading one source that said that there's some debatable, but perhaps evidence that Neanderthals also had a bear culture. I personally don't know why that is, and I didn't see a lot of information that speculates exactly why, but I have a feeling that, of course, proximity, but I wondered about the fact that the northern cultures, bears are hibernating. So you have this interesting seasonal phenomenon and a lot of winter. We got a lot of feelings in winter, right? And the idea that bear skins have provided warmth and food. So I think that connection that many people have with the animals in their environment, and that these particular ones they've also literally been ascribed mythological proportions, right? We have the Greek cultures, and we have constellations, and so there's all this mythology that goes into it. So it's a well-established phenomenon, and it was mentioned that it's less common in southern cultures, and I wonder if that has something to do with the hibernation absence. But I don't really know, and I think a lot of people have talked about it, but I didn't find a lot of stuff in my very quick research. So if anybody's a cultural anthropologist, let's talk during the discussion, and you can correct me.
So something else that she mentioned is that we're seeing, specifically in like the North American bear species, less and less time that the bears are spending hibernating, and some like areas of black bears aren't really hibernating at all anymore. And a lot of this they think can be attributed to like closeness to humans, so more easy proximity to food, and also rising climates or rising temperatures and changes in the climate that would then kind of impact their like internal clocks, being like, oh, it's cold, it's time to go sleep for a while.
Right.
So I want to pose our first question to the audience. So like kind of like a think, pair, share type question where you'll talk at your tables amongst each other. a big theme of this book was talking about how a lot of the threats that these bear species are facing are from humans, whether it's deforestation or climate change. It's causing a shrinkage in their habitats and also a shrinkage in their food sources. Something I'm curious to hear from all of y'all is how much do you think the individual consumer kind of needs to take responsibility for this as opposed to larger corporations that are contributing very heavily to climate change? So why don't we take about 10 minutes to talk as a group at our tables, then we'll come back and discuss what we've talked about individually. Cool, thank you.
Doing fine. No.
Thank you. So what do you
Lumbar
think?
support.
I know, I feel like I'm like this, like, because I feel like it's so
I've been
close to
hunched
me.
over so much today. It actually feels really good. Sit up.
I was too. I got to lab at 7 this morning to try to finish some experiments. I was like teaching someone in the lab how to do an experiment and then doing my own on top of it. And I was like, I need to finish this like by 5 so I can go home and be ready for this. But what do you think? How much responsibility should we take as individuals for like trying to not stop climate change, but like slow it down a little bit?
I think that I think it's complicated.
Yeah.
I think that there are things that we all can do to reduce consumption of materials, to make sure we find sustainable products or sustainable solutions for the products that we buy and use. I think that corporations have a role to play, but a lot of this is also policy driven, and it's a government intergovernmental problem. It's and it involves it in its ideal form collaboration with affected communities, and I think it's just such a multifaceted problem that it's probably not black and white. It's not either or. It's all of the above. But I think awareness of the problem and then taking action to educate oneself and communicate with people who can help make big change also. So it's a combination in my opinion.
What I've been seeing, like particularly with people my age, is like a couple of years ago, a lot of us being like super like, yes, gonna minimize all waste, everything. We're gonna have a waste-free home and like all of these things, being like super gung-ho, but then slowly realizing like, even if I produce no plastic waste, that's not going to have a huge impact unless everybody else does it. And even then, that's not going to have as much of an impact as more regulations being put on certain corporations. But it's something I think about a lot. Like, and a lot of bench scientists think about this all the time, how much plastic waste we produce in the lab.
Absolutely. And there are people trying to figure out how to reduce the amount of plastic that
we should go
laboratories are
back to
using.
glass everything and wash by hand and autoclave.
Right. Yeah. And there are trade-offs there, because then you're using water resources and you're using energy resources for heating things. And so there's no perfect solution, but I think I think losing hope is or feeling discouraged is natural and human, but trying to maintain a sense of, okay, so this is hard and maybe it's not working. So what can we be doing that helps make bigger changes, and how do we as individual members of our communities participate in that process? And I don't have any super great ways to solve that, but I think thinking about it and talking about it like we're doing is one step in that direction.
Yeah.
Acknowledging we each can't do it on our own, but we have to do it together.
Yeah. And something that I've become more aware of too over the last couple of years is a lot of these like what are like duped as like environmentally friendly swaps might not be as environmentally friendly as they kind of say they are, because yes, you might be using the same like more durable bag over and over as opposed to Ziploc baggies. But how many times you have to use that it offsets all of the materials that were taken to make that or the higher production stuff. So it's a lot more complicated than a lot of people think too. It's not just swapping is necessarily always going to be better, especially depending on what those products are made of and how they were made.
Yeah, and finding out that information may or may not be easy.
Yeah.
Right? So being an informed consumer and wanting to make the right decisions, sometimes we're guessing a little bit, and sometimes we learn more, and then we need to retool.
Yeah.
So I think it's all it's a challenge for sure.
Yeah.
If we solve all those challenges today, you and I were going to be winning, but I think maybe it's going to take another day.
Be out of a job. Right. They still have 5 more minutes. I guess. Is there anything that you want to talk about that I hadn't like written down earlier?
No, I'll let you do it.
Okay. I don't think we'll get through everything, but I was just like, I'm going to write as much as I can. Did you enjoy reading the book?
I read it a lot through a science journalism lens, which I found very interesting. So I enjoyed the context of it as well as the content.
I was excited to read it. Something I was excited about, but then a little bit let down by was like, so I grew up in the era of zoo books, and the only zoo book that I had was the Bear Zoo book. And I had also a bunch of like animal encyclopedias and stuff, and Sun and Moon bears were always lumped together. I think because of how similar they are. So when I found out we were reading this, I was like, I'm going to learn more about each of those individual bear species. But then she also lumped them together.
Yeah, I think that's a habitat thing,
yeah.
right? So she was trying to. They have many of the same threats and many of the same
characteristics. Humans do the same things.
Same general part of the world.
Yeah. But I was like, oh man, I thought this was my chance. Should we bring them back? We can bring them back. It's been almost 10 minutes. Yeah. All right, we're going to come back now as a big group. If anybody would like to share what they talked about kind of at their table, feel free to raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone over to you.
So we kind of decided, this specific activity depends on where you live. Like if you're in an area where you're protected by bears, there are more specific lifestyle things you can do, like play your trash. But even if you don't live near an area, it's the district that scale things you need to do, like voting for legislators that are pro-climate and protesting against police policies and that kind of overall thing. So it's a little bit of a nuanced, more nuanced answer than like what specific things you need to do.
That's a good point. I didn't even think about the idea that depending on your proximity to bears would affect how like you should be going about protecting them more. Good point. Would anybody else like to share what y'all discussed at your table? Aaron and I can talk about what we were talking about up here a little bit. Do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
I'll let you first.
Okay. So something that I talked about is how a lot of people, I feel like in their early mid 20s, have recently gotten super into like trying to be as environmentally conscious as possible, kind of taking on the mindset of, oh, it's like all up to us, and slowly realizing that even if we all, or like if I produce no plastic waste, that's not going to have as much of an impact as some maybe legislative changes might have on protecting the environment. But that doesn't mean that we are like totally disenfranchised and think that we can't make any differences at all. Just being more conscious about the differences that we're trying to make. And something in particular that I think about a lot being a bench scientist is bench scientists produce so much plastic waste. I cannot tell you how many pipette tips I use every single day. So I try to offset the plastic waste that I'm creating in the lab in my own life at home.
Yeah, and we were discussing too about some of these individual strategies for helping contribute to a more sustainable climate. That they change as we learn more. We learn more about the materials that we're using or the strategies that we use. There's a lot of debate about how effective recycling programs are in communities, for example. Is there a better way to do this? Is it worth doing? And I think those, just continuing the conversations and thinking about the fact that this is it's a multi-layered puzzle with individuals, communities, policy, multinational agreements. It's a big thing. And I think that we need to maintain, I think, a positive outlook that if we're all pitching in together and continue to push, we can find solutions for things. So it's easy to feel like we're not doing anything, or maybe our efforts don't help if we're trying to do something that we can't immediately see the results of. But I try to remain optimistic that working together will solve some of the many big problems that are facing our world.
And something that the book talked about is that as humans kind of continue to move into bear territories and the temperature of the earth changes, the range that the bears are roaming is also changing. We're seeing more and more human-bear like conflict or kind of interaction. And I was really interested in the part of the book about grizzly bears where Gloria was interviewing a farmer who was talking about how a lot of farmers or agricultural people don't want to protect bears because it threatens their lifestyle, and they can't even like go outside, enjoy their homes without having to carry a gun to protect themselves, or their kids can't play outside unsupervised, and that the bears are also impacting like the production of their crops or affecting how many cows they're breeding every year. And so something that I was curious about is how do like conservation efforts like kind of take that into account?
Well, from what I've learned from my colleagues and from what I've read, there is a huge effort to recognize that habitat degradation is at the root of much of this, and that if we can restore or preserve habitats, we will go a long way to giving bears the space that they need. That boundary of bears and people, whether it's individual people going out into maybe a forest, or whether the bear is coming in and visiting their livestock or their community, bears are just doing what bears do. They're looking for food. And as we saw from the different species, they have different levels, they have different diets, they have different levels of aggression, they have different behaviors. But minimizing that interface of human and bear is at the heart of many of the conservation initiatives that are going on for many of these species, and working with the local communities to make sure that they are heard and that their concerns are recognized, and to work with them in a culturally relevant way to make sure that it's a team effort, and that when bears are threatening people's livelihoods or their lives, that that is recognized and dealt with. And so I think this struggle about how many bears can we support in an area, a lot of it just comes down to there are more people using more land than there used to be, and that's a real challenge. And figuring that out for the future seems to be the major element that's going into the conservation stories for every one of these species. The grizzly bears and the black bears here in the United States are listed by the IUCN Red List. So the International Union for the Conservation of Nature has this big program where they help scientists figure out population trends. Those two species are doing relatively well, but that doesn't mean they're not facing habitat loss and degradation, and all of the other species are listed as vulnerable to extinction, which means that their populations are less stable, and they have some things that we're trying to address. So there are a lot of people working hard on all these things, but yeah, the more interface we have, the more challenge there is.
And that kind of brings me to another question that I had after reading the book. It seems like some of the biggest conservation success stories, at least in the bear world, are the black bear, the grizzly bear, and the panda bear. But a lot of the other bear species, specifically in Southeast Asia and in South America, don't really benefit as much, or like they haven't received as much attention or protection. Why do you think that is? Like, why does it seem like there's been a lot more focus on those three bear species than the others?
I think those are the ones we've heard about the most. I don't think there's less attention given to bears in Southeast Asia. India and China have some of the largest human populations in the world. So, but here in the United States, we're going to hear more stories about brown bears, black bears, polar bears, the ones that live near us. And I think that's just natural that we're going to hear more about those species. I think the sloth bears live in a more remote area. So while people are indeed studying them, we don't really hear much about them. I wasn't really very familiar with sloth bears, but I think it's not for a lack of effort. Part of it's just decisions about what stories get told to us.
Yeah, that makes sense.
If we lived in Southeast Asia, we would know all about the sun bears and the moon bears, and they would be literally in our communities.
That's a good point. Thanks. Kind of drawing on that, something that the book also touched upon is how like the populations of grizzly bears and black bears have increased and improved drastically in the United States to the point that agencies are sometimes trying to remove protections specifically against grizzly bears and open up trophy hunting again. Do you think that something like this will ever be accomplished? And if it is, how is that going to impact the bear populations?
Well, we'll go back to step one. I'm not a bear expert, so I don't know whether that's going to happen or not, but it's been tossed around back and forth in different political spaces now for many, many, many years. And from the reading I've done for my job, as well as reading the book, it's clear that it's both a political issue and a science issue. And I think when you have intersections of politics and science, there's always going to be voices coming from different perspectives and different constituencies that want to be heard. And I think that even the scientist that's interviewed for the book said, I don't know what to expect anymore. I think it's great news that the populations have grown and are more stable. I think, though, that back to that intersection of human communities and bear habitat is just going to continue to increase as we have more human, I don't want to call it encroachment necessarily, but more human populations in areas where these bears that roam around quite a bit looking for food may encounter. So hunting has been a part of the story for a very long time. both in more modern cultures, in indigenous cultures, for subsistence, for protection, for sport. And I think that it's a super complex and nuanced topic. And I don't know what would happen to the populations. I have no idea. If the experts don't know, I certainly don't know. But I think that the fact that people are talking about it and trying to make sure that the bears, somebody has a voice for the bears in these stories. And other people raise their voices as well, and people are communicating. So that's good, I think.
So while we're thinking about like kind of populations rising and humans and bears interacting more and more, I want to pose another question to the audience to discuss at your tables of, do you think it will truly ever be possible for bears and humans to coexist with or without conflict? So let's take about 5 to 10 minutes to discuss again as a group, and then we'll come back and talk all together.
Good.
Cool. Yay. Okay. What do you think?
Hi, people.
Hello.
Okay, so can humans and bears ever coexist?
With or without conflict?
With or without? Yeah. What do you think?
I think to exist without conflict would be very difficult because, like, even looking back at indigenous populations, there was conflict with the bears.
I agree. I mean, I think that it depends where you live, right?
Yeah.
And I think that we here in central Indiana don't think about bears every day. But if we lived in a place where they were around us all the time, we would be thinking a lot about the risk of bears. I was struck by the polar bear story
Me
of
too.
the people in the community where the polar bears were walking through their downtown. I would have a very different relationship with bears if I lived in a place where they're walking through my downtown. And I think that it's fair to acknowledge that an animal bigger than me with big teeth and big claws that could kill me is worth some attention. And that I think, I think people, people don't want to be killed at the claws of a bear. So I think that these are real threats, and I think that the threats facing the bears are real threats. And so finding a balance on an individual basis. But I think if we go back to the idea that if we're trying to wait until the bear has entered the community, it's easy to blame the bear, right?
Yeah.
And I think that if you're looking at things people can do, putting away their food, making sure they're not attracting bears is super important. But we also have to be aware of the things that people can be doing to that people can do to help make sure that there's enough habitat for bears, and that should help minimize the conflict. So it's going to take all the pieces. And is there going to be zero bear human conflict? No. I mean, they're animals that live here. So we also have conflict every day with a lot of animals that we don't talk about.
Yeah.
From the perspective of a bug I may have stepped on, that was a pretty big human-animal conflict.
Yeah.
Or the mosquito that I swatted that might be carrying a disease, right? So I think, how we frame that relationship may not be just a bear-specific problem.
So you mentioned the polar bear story, and something that I was also really taken by was kind of the reverence that village has towards polar bears, even though they're super aggressive towards them, super dangerous, lots of people die. But that's almost juxtaposed to the hatred a lot of people have towards sloth bears, even though they're both largely doing the same things, like almost preying on people, mauling people, killing them. I don't know if I have more to say about that, but that was something that I found really interesting. It
is an interesting thing, and I wasn't as familiar with some of the bears from other parts of the world, and it was interesting to see how those relationships have evolved for individuals in their own challenges, but also for whole communities or nations or cultures. And I think it just highlights that there's no one way to be a bear. There's no one way to be a person, and that all of these relationships are super complex, and what may work one place isn't necessarily going to work somewhere else for a variety of complicated reasons, many of which may be out of the hands of the individual people involved. And you know, the conservationists would say it all just gets back to habitat. You know, bears need their space, as do a lot of species.
I think what I think is we're already living coexisting with the bears. It's possible, but to live without major conflict would require almost like an attitude shift of some people, because there's some people who are like super like, yes, let's save the bears, and some people who are like, no,
Right.
let's not save the bears.
Right.
And until everybody's kind of on the same page, we're going to be having conflicts with ourselves as well as having conflicts with the bears.
Yeah, and I think you could replace the word bear with a lot
anything.
of different species,
Yeah.
and you could have the same conversation. So I think our individual community and broader human society's relationship with wildlife is a complex one, and we continue to learn more all the time about the needs that are facing us, how we're all interconnected species, and I think that's starting to become more. I think it's revealed more all the time, and so as we continue to learn more, it should help us make better decisions. But yeah, not everybody's going to agree, and for a variety of reasons. And I think that kind of discussion is important and probably helpful to remember that different people have different perspectives. I think you're good.
You're good. All right, so we're going to bring it back together as a group. Would anybody like to share what y'all discussed at your table? Again, feel free to raise your hand. We'll bring a microphone over to you. Yeah.
The question was about whether humans and bears can coexist peacefully, and we decided no, probably not at this point. Coexistence we do have is very unstable. Like efforts, for example, like conservation and in Yosemite coexist with the bears. I mean, there's there, and like through a lot of effort in bring populations back, but also we're still including their habitat. The population is still increasing, and in the case of the polar bears, we're still not disrupting their habitat. So. It seems kind of unlikely at this point that we're going to get really peaceful coexistence with the bears. Especially because your terms are like animal crime, you want to say they're not the highest on the list.
Yeah. Sam, we got over here. Over here.
Yay!
I guess it kind of depends on what your definition of coexist is. I think we have been able to make some operations of our own stance of coexisting. So it's coexisting having absolutely no conflict or perceived negative running from anything that would be accurate to the natural world. I think that coexisting with bears has been successfully done in indigenous populations, and it wasn't always everybody gets along with life. We understand there's a balance, there's a natural place for violence and other creatures, but ideally there's such a racialization allowing another viewpoint to receive I think coexistence can happen in a way that we are not this serious.
That was something we had talked about a little bit too. Like, will we ever live with no conflict? No. Even looking back, indigenous populations have had conflict with bears throughout history. It's what is your definition, I guess, of conflict? And Erin brought up a really good point of like conflict is not just like the bears inconvenience us. It could be us inconveniencing, like she mentioned, if I step on a bug, that was a huge conflict for the bug that day. Maybe not for me, but for the bug, definitely. Anybody else want to share? Okay. Well, I'm going to kind of make a little bit of a radical jump to another topic that I wanted to talk about. So a good portion of the book was focused on the bile farming of the moon bears and the sun bears in Southeast Asia. And it got me to thinking about how, it's obviously a very inhumane practice. The bears are in a lot of pain. They're kept in cages. They're not treated very well. Many of them are developing skin diseases over the course of their life in these tiny cages. But we also kind of have a lot of unethical treatment of animals in the United States when you look at like food production of chicken and beef or other animals that we're growing for slaughter. And I'm curious if you think there might ever be a way to kind of ethically farm bile from bears, or is this always going to be something that's considered super unethical because of the effect it has on the bears?
Yeah, I think that's a tough one.
Yeah.
They mentioned that bear bile may have some useful medicinal properties. I looked to see what conservationists had to say about this, and they perhaps not unexpectedly would recommend that we focus on reducing demand. Whenever there's a product that has taken on a proportion that is devastating to a population, the goal usually is to work with local communities to find a way to reduce demand for that product, recognizing that this is difficult and culturally can be culturally sensitive, and we need to understand the place of these species like bears or anything else in a community's perspective. People also have livelihoods and they're trying to make a livelihood, but I think that from a strictly animal conservation perspective, the goal is to reduce demand. From a community perspective, I think there might be other points of view that could be argued. I think that I think you might want to be able to think about a nuance between a food product and a medicinal product, but that's a gray area. So I think it's a really tough problem, and it's clearly one that communities are grappling with. And the stories of the communities there, they already had regulations about it, and how do people work with those or around them or against them? What are the conservationists trying to do? Clearly, there's no really terrific answer on this, but the main conservation line is reduce demand.
Jumping to a still ethically, morally gray area, but more fun. I was very surprised to learn about the Yosemite bear feeding shows that used to happen. Had you heard of that before?
I had not, no.
I can't believe that they would just throw food out, have all the bears come and people pay to watch. Something that I was curious about, and this might be going way beyond your realm of expertise, but I wonder if that at all contributed to kind of, at least the bears in that area, losing fear of humans. And if something like that could be done more ethically using like actual things that the bears would eat in their environment, like deer meat or other like locally available fruits for the bears. Again, might be way beyond your area of expertise.
Well, yeah, but I think this culture of don't feed the bears was sort of comical for a while. Anybody seen Yogi Bear cartoons, right? Going to get the picnic basket. This idea that bears will eat anything, especially brown bears, is not, it's not wrong, right? They're omnivores and they'll seek out food. There's huge campaigns right now about preventing, making sure you have your food secured if you are in areas with bears so that we don't attract them. And those are lessons learned from things like that. But, the idea of having entertainment, watching bears eat, well, that's how we learn things that it took many years to kind of reverse the situation, generations of bears. So, the current messaging is don't feed the bears, but not only don't feed the bears, but don't let the bears come and feed themselves.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of those important lessons that we learn from experiences like that.
Because in some instances, it's okay to feed the bears, like if you're working at one of the panda sanctuaries in China, where you literally pay to go and feed them bamboo and take care of them and sweep up their poop every day. Something that I found fascinating was just how much of panda conservation has been done in these sanctuaries and how few panda bears have been released to the wild. Is this something that's been seen kind of with other species of animal, or is it something that's kind of unique to the panda bear?
Well, pandas are notorious for being really slow breeders. Their populations just don't grow quickly, and there's this, whole complicated international panda diplomacy program that is complicated and involves a lot of money and a lot of institutions. The conservation in the wild, though, there's a lot of conservation habitats that have been set up for pandas, and one of the trickle-down effects is that many species that also live there have a protected place to live. So sometimes when you're trying to protect one species, you either intentionally or unintentionally may end up protecting many. And so that's kind of a nice piece of that. There are other stories of animals that are bred or raised in human care and then released to the wild, some with success and some reaching for success. Locally, the Indianapolis Zoo partners with Purdue University and several other institutions and nature groups to raise hellbenders. Anybody heard of a hellbender? They're charismatic little salamanders, and they live in streams and rivers. And they live here in Indiana, but their habitat has had some struggles from pollution and disturbance. And so different groups are raising eggs and growing them to a point where they can survive and then releasing them into these rivers with some good success. So that's a very different kind of animal with a very different kind of reproduction. But it is a strategy that has been taken on for a variety of species with a variety of successes or not.
So something that Gloria touched upon in the book, and just to put it bluntly, she said that pandas probably experience a lot more kind of public focus and conservation efforts because they're cute. How, I guess, it makes me think of another super critically endangered species, the spectacled bear. And they're not as well known. Many people don't know what they look like, if they've even heard of them. And they're incredibly shy and hard kind of to even reach, even if you're a bear conservationist trying to study and protect spectacled bears. How does that kind of shyness and elusiveness impact conservation efforts surrounding that bear or other species of animals that are super shy and hard to reach?
A lot. It's difficult to figure out how many there are or what their habits are or where they're moving around. Same is true for nocturnal species, right? If they're active at night, you're going to have a hard time seeing them. There has been there's some new technologies that are using things like drones to get better images of species that were difficult to follow before. So I think there's some real optimism for a lot of conservation priorities for elusive species to be able to maybe have some new ways of without bothering them, being able to go in and track populations. Because if you don't know how many there are, or you don't know whether their populations are growing or shrinking, you don't know what to do about the situation. And it all starts with population numbers. So I think that's a big piece of it. And your point about pandas are cute. There's a phrase, charismatic megafauna. Anybody ever heard that? So there are some animals that we think have a lot of charisma. They tend to be larger ones, or they're kind of cute. And maybe you're more interested in the panda story for species conservation than you are for a mayfly or a salamander that's also called a snot otter. The hellbenders have many colorful names. So the idea that we connect with things with faces, that we connect with things that look like us or look like our pets, that's natural. That's called being human. But it definitely has shaped some conservation priorities, but certainly not all.
That was something I was curious about too, because I was like thinking back, like even to childhood, most of the conservation efforts that I heard of growing up, unless they were like local, like to the swamp in Florida, specific fish or specific bugs, it was always big, usually mammalian, furry, cute animals. So you're saying that the visual appeal and the charisma of the animal has a huge impact on the ability kind of to market it as a conservation story?
Yeah, it can. But also there are ecological roles to be considered. If something's a top predator in an ecosystem, they may have an outsized impact on that habitat or that ecosystem if their numbers change a lot. So I think it can be a little more nuanced than that. But people do tend to like, they like larger animals that they're more familiar with or that they learned about as children.
Right. We've been talking for almost an hour. So is there any, parting wisdom or words that you want to leave us with about the book or about conservation science in general before we open it up to the whole room for questions?
Okay. Well, I'll just put in a plug for the Maiden Conservation Message for Bears, which is don't let them get to your food. That's a good reminder. And if you're traveling somewhere where there are likely to be bears, just being aware of wildlife in general, and maybe thinking about some of these challenges that people have who are living with them every day. I think the other thing I'll just say about the book, as a science communicator, I really enjoyed the journalistic approach that this book took. She is a journalist, the author, and the storytelling of people on the front lines, both individual community members and also the scientists, gave a nice juxtaposition of positions and challenges. And I really learned some new things. And I like it when I read a book and learn new things. So I thought it was a great choice.
Well, thank you so much. Does anybody in the audience have any questions or comments that they would like to share? A brave soul. Thank you.
Yeah. So, did everybody hear the question? The question was, part of the book touched briefly on how, what kind of intelligence bears have and how it's displayed, their behaviors, and whether there's any other research going on. It's been pretty limited from what I understand, at least from what I've read about brown bears. But there are people that look at their ability to solve puzzles and solve problems, and they can unlock these bear-resistant containers with practice. So clearly, they have good memories for finding food, and The cubs learn from their mothers. So I don't think anybody disputes that they're not an intelligent, smart animal. They're a large mammal with a brain that is mammalian. So yeah, they're pretty smart. But I think doing behavioral studies with them has not kept pace with maybe some of the other animals that I've read about. But my reading on the subject has been fairly limited.
Is there any research that you're aware to determine adequate population would be for sustainable, given with no resources necessarily but one colony is not enough to sustain. So it's really thought on what that number looks like and then allow that
Yeah, I think that's at the crux of some of the debate here. That one of the scientists in the book that was interviewed about brown bears, grizzlies, looking at this question we discussed earlier about whether they should have federal protection, should not have federal protection. It all comes down to how many bears should there be and how many could be supported. And I think that that species has such a wide range and their food resources are very different from one place to another. So I think a lot of those decisions are kind of local, and I think that's true for many of the other species as well. We know that bears need enough space to follow their food if it changes seasonally. So if there's more food, they need less space. But if we keep reducing the amount of space, then there may not be enough food, and then they come into human communities. So I know that people are making those estimates. I'm stalling a bit because I'm trying to think of what the number was that was quoted in the book, but it's like 3,000. Yeah, thanks for confirming my brain, for grizzly bears under, I guess, an assumption of non-changing other parameters, right? Other variables. So they're large animals and they are up there in the food chain. So the number that you need to be sustainable isn't as many as, say, insects, right? And I think that's the calculus for any species that's undergoing policy decisions is how much space they need, how much can it support, and how many do you really need for reproduction and all that. So a few thousand in a particular area might be a good answer. I am not a bear expert.
From Indianapolis Zoo. I was just wondering, after reading this book, from your perception as a science writer from Indianapolis Zoo, what is the one thing that we should know about bears after reading this really great book?
Don't feed the bears. But as animals, I think I think that their diversity is something to celebrate. I think that it's neat that the author chose to frame the book with the 8 different species of bears. I think knowing that there's more kinds of bears than maybe you think about is kind of neat. Bears have amazing adaptations. They're very adaptable. Clearly, they've figured out how to live just about anywhere on the planet, as long as there's space for them and that the climate doesn't change too much, that their habitat changes too much. But I think that they are charismatic. They're a little enigmatic. We don't know everything about bears. And I think reminding ourselves we don't know everything is always a good take-home message. But be willing to learn and celebrate learning new things.
All right. Well, I want to thank you again, Erin, for
Sure.
coming, taking time out of your Tuesday evening to share your expertise with us and talk about this book. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Super fun. Thanks.
It's also good to see you again.
Yes.
I also want to thank Ash and Elm for hosting us again this month. Our next event will be Magic Little Pill, which is a book about weight loss drugs, and that will be the last Tuesday in October, which I believe is October 29th. I also want to thank all of our partners, Indiana Humanities, Indiana Sciences, March for Science Indy, and Indiana Public Libraries. Am I forgetting any? Okay. And, oh, that's the one in September. I thought we were in September already. Sorry. But the next one is Magic Little Pill, and it's at the end of September. Sorry about that. And I look forward to seeing you all again next month. Thanks for coming, everyone. I thought September was already over.
No, it's still
I was so ready for Halloween.